Here's an unsolicited reminder that spectacles means glasses. Now, if you remove the second S from spectacles, you get a spectacle, which is a performance that is, well, at least in its conventional meaning, very impressive and exciting to look at. Speaking of impressive, you would probably say the event in question is spectacular, something worthy of being seen. And here's an out-of-nowhere question. Have you ever had a reflection while probably watching the sunset in the distant horizon? As you do that, you may experience introspection, a thoughtful look inward. Then you look back at the past events that got you here, what happened in retrospect. And with your best effort to be optimistic, you look forward to the great future, to so many prospective, life-changing events. Isn't it fascinating that we usually think about someone or something deeply during or immediately after seeing everything around us? In fact, this is no mere coincidence because many of these thought-related words originated from the Latin root specere, which basically means to see or to view. Welcome to the first episode of the Etymology series, where the story about to unfold is going to be spectacular. The spect in all these words has its root in specere from Latin. That said, specere is most unlikely a direct parent of spect, but rather some sort of ancestor. This may oversimplify a lot of details, but it is because specere had many siblings, and each of them produced many offspring, and thanks to the long history of language evolution, each of those offspring even further produced its subsequent offspring and so on. Even specere itself also had its parent, the root spec from Proto-Indo-European, aka pie. However, without going too deep, I would just refer to specere as the root, as it's arguably the most prominent one. Therefore, the implication is that in this video, I will usually mention only the root specere and the words of the latest generation, and sadly, but inevitably skip most of what happened in between the lineage, unless it's really interesting. Anyway, so far we've been looking at the physical dimension of specere, but not the abstract one. But I think it's safe to say that most abstract concepts are generally formed after observing the concrete world. For example, when you see someone or something in front of you, it's important to keep in mind that this only happens in the present. Nobody knows the exact future, but everybody constantly predicts it. So at the moment you look out at something in a given moment, your mind automatically wanders into the future through anticipation. The prefix of out is x. When combined with spectare, which is one form of specere, it literally means to look out. Hence, the word became expect in modern English. Speaking of out, the opposite is in. When we look into something closely, we examine that thing thoroughly. Hence the word inspect. There's another closely related prefix which is intro. It functions very similar to in, but the focus is more on the inward or within. Just as we look into a physical thing to examine it, we look into ourselves to examine our thoughts and feelings. This is when we have an introspective moment. Before we progress, I would like to mention a part of Steve Jobs' arguably most famous quote. You can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backward. It perfectly encapsulates the truth that introspection is extremely difficult to achieve, if not impossible, without looking into the past, our past. Retro is the prefix indicating a position from behind or backward. So when we do a survey of our past events, we are looking at them in retrospect. Now, let's make the quote feel complete. If backward portrays the past, then it is forward that portrays the future. Pro is the prefix indicating a position in front or forward. The literal meaning of the word prospect is the view in front of you, the landscape you look at from afar. Therefore, the figurative meaning conveys a sense of positive future outlook. We already talked about looking backward, but that's more of the figurative sense of reflection and less of the literal sense of turning back and looking at what's behind you. Imagine you just walk past an ordinary looking person. At first, you may not think much of them, but then you suddenly recall that they are important. Now, you take them seriously. You regard them. The prefix re means back or again. That's why when you look back at someone, you respect them. Now, there's this word that I have to admit that I cannot find a way to craft a compelling narrative, and that is suspect. Personally, I found the etymological explanation lacking because it left a gap unfilled. It went like sub is a prefix indicating a position from under or beneath. It was reduced to su in front of s, hence specere, meaning to look at from below or to look at secretly, distrustfully. The sad gap is why just looking at someone from below makes that person suspicious. Maybe there was a piece of contextual evidence gone missing, or it was always there but I just couldn't find it. Anyway, it is what it is, so please move on. What are you looking at? Yes, you are looking at. Okay, sorry, that's a lame joke, I know, but bear with me. One of the probable roots from which at is derived is Latin ad, meaning to, toward, and at itself. The prefix is reduced to a when placed in front of sp, resulting in the Latin verb aspicere and subsequently aspect. Interestingly, the original meaning was literally to look at. However, at some point later in time, the meaning became relative position of the planets as they appear from Earth, and thereby the word was used in astrological terminology. I couldn't find a strong piece of evidence which explains the shift from the astrological meaning, how two planets look at one another from the Earth's point of view, to the current meaning, a particular part or feature of a situation, idea, or problem. But according to the Oxford English Dictionary, it states the astrological sense was apparently the earliest and often colored the others. Astrologically speaking, the positions of any two planets in relation to your place of birth, apparently on Earth, form an angle. And an astrologer uses that piece of information to analyze your particular area of life. So the Oxford explanation may imply that such a concept, that specific angle of analysis, was carried over to the modern meaning, many aspects of anything. But even with the same planet couple, they may yield varying angles depending not only on the relative positions, but also on where and when one is born. With the same aspect, one might find it positive, whereas another might find otherwise. In other words, different individuals have different perspectives. Per is similar to pro, which means forward or through. So perspicere means to look through. Originally, the meaning extended to science of optics, but just like many other words in this series, the meaning was later used in a mental, figurative sense. Your perspective is the unique lens, the unique point you look through, that shapes your mental view of a situation. In part 1, I briefly mentioned that specere had many siblings, and each of them produced many offspring. and each of those offspring even further produce its subsequent offspring. One kind of the said offspring is called derivatives, and the process which produces them is called derivation. In a nutshell, derivation is the formation of a new word, and not always but quite often, that new word, 1, has a noticeably different meaning and /or 2 belongs in a different grammatical category than the original word it is derived from. So it shouldn't surprise you if it turns out that species shares the same root as respect and spectacular. But what's surprising is that the word was not initially used in a biological context. The original Latin meaning was appearance, shape, form, and later extended to a class included under a higher class, a number of individuals having common characteristics peculiar to them. In other words, it meant a distinct class of something based on common characteristics, and from then, I guess it was when the word usage was adopted into biological science, things that are grouped together because they look alike. One of species' descendants is specialist. Since species focus on appearance and distinct qualities, specialists focus on particularity, a thing or person marked off from others by some distinguishing quality. Needless to say, the current word is special. In addition, the suffix ficus means making or doing, so when combined with species, it became specificus, meaning being considered a class or type. And for one to be considered a class or type, one must have a special determining quality. To paraphrase, the special quality is specific to one, and to be specific, you have to mention something or someone precisely. In other words, you have to specify it. Besides species, another two derivatives which seem to have undergone some sort of meaning diversion are specimen and spectrum. Let's briefly talk about specimen first. Its original definition was a pattern or model. Though we still can see the similarity between a model and a single example of something, the modern definition gives much less emphasis on being a representative. Next is spectrum. It used to mean a phantom or apparition, but guess what word took its place? Yes, it's spectre. The then spectrum is now spectre. But what about the now spectrum? How come it became a band of colored lights in order of their wavelengths? I will attach a link to the full story in the video description below, but here is a too long don't read version. There was once this random guy named Sir Isaac Newton. He was obsessed with light and color, even performing dangerous experiments on his own eyes to understand the strange, ethereal, ghostly colors he saw. He later moved on to use prisms, discovering that when white light passed through, it separated into an ordered, fixed arrangement of colors. When he published his findings, he named this band of light spectrum, with the now obsolete sense of apparition because, to him, the colors felt like a phantom image he had observed in his earlier experiments. Another interesting word is speculate. It came from specula, a watchtower, or speculate, a view from a vantage point. Unlike many other words, speculate is a back formation of speculation, which means speculation came to exist before speculate, not the other way around. Originally, it meant to view mentally or contemplate. From then, there were probably two major meaning expansions, both of which are commonly used in everyday conversations. The first development was from a literal to a figurative sense, from looking at something visible to considering a subject by turning it in the mind and viewing it in its different aspects. The second development, which I think the investors are gonna love, was moving to financial sense, the act of assuming a business risk in hope of gain. The likely explanation was put very nicely in a Merriam-Webster article, as usual, link in the description. It reads, "Financial speculation requires both knowledge and imagination, so the figurative use of seeing, in this case, involves looking at the investment in question and contemplating its likelihood of success." With this, I do hope a lot of investors would contemplate hard before making any speculation. In the simplest forms, we have look up to someone and look down on someone. Our intuition associates the upper position with a greater status and the lower position with a lesser status. The prefix of down is D. For example, descent is going down from a higher place. Combining it with specere, we arrive at despicere and then later despise, the act of looking down upon with strong contempt from a superior position. Similarly, whether you want to agree with this or not, a supervillain devising a plan to steal the moon and housing thousands of yellow minion creatures deserves to be looked down upon, thus despicable him. Another result of despicere branching out into Old French was despite, meaning act designed to humiliate someone. I tend to think of the mindset this creates as rebellious. At any point in history, there's always a set of societal norms that one must comply with, otherwise they will get punished. Nonetheless, those rebels choose to defy the rules. They despise any attempts that will get in their ways. In defiance of the norms, they break the rules. Or to speak in an old-fashioned way, in despite of the norms, they break the rules. And since despite got shortened to despite, you would just say, in spite of the norms, they break the rules. What's funny is that, and please be super attentive, despite what happened to despite, you never say spite as in spite what happened to despite still remains intact. Are you tired of despite? If so, let's take a break. Here's a respite. It came from an old French root, respite, which in fact shared the same Latin root as the word respect. When you respect someone, you grant them an extension of time for an action, or you delay your judgment, essentially a grace period. This idea of looking back at or regarding someone's situation is what makes a respite a delay or a period of rest from stress or difficulty. Right now, we've reached almost the end of the story already. So, let's briefly mention our old High Germanic neighbor, spehon. This one wasn't derived from our Latin protagonist specere, but shared the same pi parent, spec. The German root still kept the core idea of watching, but shifted the context from public observation to secret surveillance. Then it made its way to France, first became espion, and got borrowed by English as espionage, which is the activity of secretly getting information by using spies. Speaking of spies, you know, the word spy also came from the French espier, meaning watching stealthily. This can't just be a coincidence, right? And now, our spectacular journey is coming to an end. I want to end this video on a strongly optimistic, positive note because, you know, our lives are already hard enough. Since the entire etymology revolves around the concept of seeing or looking, when you finally go outside, please look up in the sky and you may see some birds fly. The Latin root of bird is avis, and the combination of avis and our own root specere gave birth to auspex, which literally means bird observer. In ancient Rome, those bird observers were augurs, and their practice was augury. They would study the flight patterns to deliver prophecies. Since such practice was deeply connected to divination, We have the phrase under the auspices of to tell us something is being under the benevolent influence of a greater power, and the adjective form of auspice is auspicious, meaning a promising future. Theoretically, a prophecy can either turn out good or bad, but like I said, our lives are already hard enough, so I wish you an auspicious journey. Thanks for watching.